Hey everyone, welcome to this introductory video for tool-assisted speedrunning Celeste. So far we've covered how to use the task tools. Now we're going to take a step up from tool-assisted gameplay to tool-assisted speedruns. We're going to delve into the theory behind tasking. We'll be covering routing for both screens and areas. After that we'll take a look at some general principles of optimization. And finally we'll finish up with the optimal movement for a variety of general cases. So you've got a level that you want to task, or perhaps just a very complicated screen. How do you begin to approach routing it? First, find existing runs. If someone has made an any percent task and you're tasking all red berries, steal as much of the inputs as you can. If you're tasking a challenge play like grabless or orbless or whatever wacky variant you've come up with, steal as much as you can from the normal tasks. Not only is it easy, but looking through those inputs might teach you a trick or two that you can use when you're on your own. Now a lot of people will say that they don't want to copy inputs or look at existing tasks because they want to learn for themselves, and that's great. What I would recommend in that case is to task a couple screens at a time, and then when you're done, compare those to the existing tasks. See where you're gaining or losing time and figure out why. You can then take that knowledge with you as you start on the next screens. What I think is not a valid excuse for avoiding existing tasks is that you want to do all the work on your own. Now I get that you can be really excited about tasking a new map, and seeing that someone beat you to it can be a little disheartening. But that's no excuse not to do your research. Better to have multiple pairs of eyes all looking at the same task file and tweaking it and sharing strats that might inspire other strats, than to have multiple tasks of the same map that are all unoptimized. So do what you can. Search around YouTube, ask on the Celeste Discord. If you're brave, there are even a lot of tasks to find on Chinese websites. If you genuinely can't find a task to copy, then look for a speedrun. Obviously a speedrun might not know about or might not attempt everything a task can, but it will be a good starting place. Don't rely on a speedrun exclusively for strats, but if you can find one, you should watch it at least once to make sure that you aren't missing anything big. If you can't even find a speedrun, then look for similar sections of existing maps that have been tasked. I recommend not just watching the task, but actually downloading it and skimming through it frame by frame. You may spot some things that aren't obvious on the surface. Now there's no perfect solution to routing, no algorithm you can follow that will produce the most optimized route. That's why we're still seeing pretty much continual improvements to the existing tasks. So I'm just going to try and offer some general tips for approaching the problem. We'll start with some advice that can apply to both individual screens and entire maps. First, see if there's anywhere you can build up massive amounts of speed. Moving blocks and water are both great for this. It can sometimes be difficult to judge when it's worth building up speed and when it's worth taking the most direct route, but in general, losing several frames to build up speed that you carry across the room or across multiple rooms is almost always worth it. And losing a few frames to build up speed that you lose immediately is not worth it. Second, work backwards. Figure out what is the absolute last place you need to get before beating the level, and then figure out how to get there. Always test your assumptions. Do I really need to get that key? Do I really need to move this block? You don't want to task an entire screen just to realize that you could have skipped all the doorbell coins. Console loading into a specific position is great for this, because you can test the end of a screen without having to task the beginning. Now, if a skip is not obviously faster, because it requires a lot of weird movement or something, I would recommend tasking the intended route first, particularly if other people are going to be looking at your tasks. They might think, well, they used this skip so it must be faster, which is not always the case. Oftentimes, there will be no clear-cut fastest strat, and you'll just have to time multiple options. In that case, you can start off with a slapdash timing for each one. As you're tasking, you can certainly think to yourself, I could probably save a frame here with a 6-frame bunny hop, or 2 frames here if I manipulated my position to land sooner, and just keep that in mind. Most of the time what will happen is that you time both routes, and one is faster by 10 frames or more, and, well, even if you optimized both versions, that one's probably going to be faster. It's only when strats are within your perceived error margins that you need to start optimizing to really determine a winner. Or, if you're on a tight deadline, just take the faster one and don't worry about losing maybe 3 frames on your first draft. When you're comparing multiple strats against each other, it's usually going to be to some sort of synchronization point where the TASes cross paths. A good sync point is usually one that Madeline is required to reach while going through the room or map with the same conditions, same speed, same number of dashes, etc. Some common sync points include screen transitions, especially vertical ones since they reset your speed, the tops of large walls since Madeline will usually finish climbing with no dashes left and land exactly on the corner with pretty close to no speed, and mandatory bubbles, Badalons, and dream blocks, since they all reset Madeline's speed. Just make sure they are indeed mandatory. And finally, limiting conditions, which we'll talk more about in a bit. When you're racing two routes to one of these sync points, you can sometimes cut off the timing early if it's obvious that one route is going to be slower. Let's say you begin tasking a second route that is supposed to save time by building up more speed. If you get halfway through that route and realize you're farther behind and going slower after the part that was supposed to be faster, it's pretty safe to discard it without making it to the sync point. You can even try testing your routes casually, not just with the task tools. You may realize that the route you thought would work is actually fundamentally flawed without spending all that time tasking it. That being said, when you're new to tasking, and even when you're not, you probably want to test multiple routes anyway, even if you're pretty sure that one is faster. Think of it like a test of your intuitions. If it is indeed faster, then you pass the test and you've developed a good understanding. If it turns out that the strat you were confident in ends up being slower, then not only have you avoided taking a slower route, but you also learn from it. That's some general advice on how to approach routing. Now let's talk about actually planning routes. For starters, the most direct path is usually the fastest. If you don't have a lot of speed that you're trying to conserve or a very slow section to avoid, then try to minimize the distance you have to travel. It may be tempting to think if I back up here then I can go faster for the next part, but keep in mind that increasing your speed by 20% over 20 frames will still only save you 4 frames, which you've probably already lost by taking a less direct route. A longer path usually needs to go significantly faster on average to save time. Never wait for stuff unless you absolutely have to. In this case I'm talking about things like waiting for a zipper to move, or a cloud to bounce, or a swap block to come back. If you're waiting for something to build up speed, that's fine, but if you're just waiting for it to cross the room, try and find another way around. This is where it takes some skill, but usually a well-executed parkour sequence is faster than waiting for a moving platform to take you a short distance. By the same token, whenever you're tasking rooms with swap blocks, it's pretty safe to assume that they'll always be located at the end of their track. Unless one is absolutely required to move all the way back, you'll be dashing between them so fast that they don't have time to reset. In general, dashes are fast, so usually a TAS is going to be using every dash it can. That also means a TAS will generally seize every opportunity it can to give Madeline back her dashes. There are of course some exceptions to that rule, most notably if getting a dash back requires a rather circuitous route and doesn't help much later, then it's probably best to sacrifice one dash for a more direct path. Similarly, you want to make sure that you're using each dash to its fullest potential. Most of the time this is obvious. If you're on flat ground, you'll be using it to go forward. If you're climbing, then you'll probably want to use it to wall bounce, and if you're in mid-air, then you want to use your dashes to send you in the straightest route to the next objective. Where all of this gets a bit tricky is in spots like core, where you don't get dashes back nearly as frequently. In that case, you need to carefully consider which spots to use a dash would save you the most time. Which brings us to the more complicated side of routing. So what I've pulled up on screen now is an example of some of the more difficult routing challenges you're liable to face. Could be collectibles in a single screen, so strawberry seeds, doorbell key coins, or it could be stuff across multiple screens like berries or keys. Since there are 18 objects here, if we were to time every possible route, it would require timing 342 individual segments, which is obviously out of the question. So how can we go about approaching this? First we want to identify choke points. What we are looking for is similar to sync points, places that Madeline has to cross going from one spot to another. This lets us simplify our timings. For instance, if we're comparing these two routes, we only need to time each one from the choke point. The next important things to identify are neum spots, places where Madeline can build up a lot of speed. note that just because you find a spot where you can go really fast doesn't always make it worth it. Suppose, for instance, that we can build up a lot of speed in this room and fling ourselves all the way across over here to this one. Now we need to ask ourselves, does this actually save time? Suppose that it takes 5 seconds to perform this fling. Well, if we take a look at the average distance between these objects, and most of them are about 3 seconds apart, so all other things being equal, launching this way actually loses time over an average route. There may be other reasons that it saves time, for instance if we were able to snag this object along the way without losing speed, or if there were a very large gap here that would normally take a long time to work around. If the speed lets us just fling straight across to this object, then it would be worth it. But these are the sort of things that it's good to keep in mind before we start trimming down the problem. Let's look at this pair of objects in the center. They look pretty close together, so it seems to make sense that we would collect both at once. If you're just routing by eye, you can probably make that assumption, but if you want to be absolutely sure, there's only a few things you would need to time. First, let's assume the rest of the route has already been finished, except for this guy, and we'll compare how much time it would take to collect it in different ways. First, from this one, let's say it takes a seconds to go over there and come back. Now let's say there's a path over here that makes use of this area, but doesn't actually enter the room with the collectible in it. Then we just need to time how long that section of the path normally takes, and how much time it would take to instead get this guy and then return. Let's say it takes B seconds, which is slower than A, which is good for our hypothesis, because then it's more optimal to fit it in adjacent to the other collectible than from the other path. Now that's assuming that no paths enter this room. Say a path did enter that room and exit the other side without taking that collectible. Then let's ask ourselves, why does it not connect to this other one? That would imply that there's some other path which comes in here, grabs that guy, and then exits. But then why don't we simply change that path to grab this guy, and change that path to not? And if that happens to be faster than all the alternatives, then we can safely say, with confidence, that these two collectibles will be adjacent in the finished route. We can do a similar sort of trick over here, but on a larger scale. These objects are sort of separated from the rest of the group, so it seems unreasonable that we're going to make multiple trips to this area. If you're just making a casual task, then that's probably good enough to isolate them as a group. However, if you're really diving into optimization, here's something to consider. Suppose the fastest route did make multiple trips into this area. Now let's do a little rearranging. I'm going to delete these two segments, and instead add in these two segments. The rest of the route is exactly the same, except now the first path goes in, cleans up its portion, then jumps to the second path, cleans up its portion, and then exits, and the other two paths just pop in and immediately back out. So now instead of timing two entirely separate routes, we can just time the two segments we added against the two segments we deleted. If we time the worst case scenario for something like this, and find that the adjusted path is always faster, we can be fairly confident that it's safe to isolate this group. We can usually rule out extreme options. For instance, if we had two paths that both come in through this choke point, one of them is going to be going to this guy, but where's the other one going? If it's going down here or over here, it would be more efficient to come in through this choke point rather than up here. So we can rule out the possibility that we have two routes coming in through there. And similarly, we can do the same for where it exits down in this area. And finally, if we do some testing and find out that there's exactly one worst case option that could be faster, for instance something like this, then we can simply split our routing into two cases. The case where we collect these in one pass, and the worst case scenario, which already narrows down things a lot if you look at it. Because this path is now probably going to be going this way, this one's going to be coming through here, these are both going to have to exit this way in some regard because they can't connect to each other, because they're both going into this area. If one was going out, we would just connect it like that. So you can see this sort of worst case scenario is kind of creating two large loops around the map, which is likely going to be pretty slow. So I'm just going to go ahead and say that these 4 objects are probably all together in the route. Once we've narrowed it down a bit, we can start to look for a first draft. Even if you're going to be testing multiple routes eventually, it's good to have one completed. A, it feels good to make progress, and B, it gives you a comparison point to time other routes against. The first thing to do is look for huge time save or time loss in one path. Take Huge Mess All Red Berries route, for instance. There's a trick with the heart that lets us skip past several rooms. It's such a massive time save that even if doing towels before books is marginally slower, it'll still be well in the lead. Compare that with the Huge Mess No Left Presses route. In this case, if we do books after towels, then we have to wait for this crystal to respawn in order to complete the room. Waiting for that takes so long that it makes sense not to do that in the route. Oftentimes you can find stuff like this just by running it casually. If a route feels slow to run RTA, then it probably is. The next thing to look for is map bias, stuff that forces one direction to be faster than another. For instance, falling down is almost always faster than climbing up. If there's a strong wind in one direction, it'll usually be faster to go with the wind than against it. Or maybe there's a room that's just really awkward to do in one direction, but easy in the other. Once you've identified this bias, you can think about how to minimize the slowness. If there's a strong left wind across the entire map, what rooms are the fastest to do going right? You aren't going to be gaining or losing much time by choice of leftward rooms, since they're all so fast anyway. But if you choose a poor room to go right, you could be fighting the wind for a long time, so route around that. Same deal if there's an item that's in a tough to reach location. Like, let's say this one. If that item from the bottom of the room requires a cumbersome climb up a bunch of weird auto-scroller platforms, but is really easy to just grab from the right side, then we're probably going to be doing this in the final route. So now with all this information, we're just looking to make a first draft that minimizes distance traveled. Since we've already taken into consideration all the spots where Madeline can build up a lot of speed or lose a lot of time, it's safe to assume that her speed through the remaining areas is roughly consistent, and we can see that our route pretty much writes itself. All that's left are these 2 items that don't nicely tie into any of the nearby paths. In this case, we're probably just going to have to time each option. And the easiest way to do that is to compare deviations from each of the paths. So instead of timing this entire route for every option, just suppose we already have a time for it. Then we're going to time each of these segments with and without going on a detour, and just see which detour loses the least amount of time. Now we're going to switch gears a bit from large-scale routing to micro-optimizations. This is the sort of stuff you should know about that will save you frames all over the TAS. And the first thing we're going to talk about is limiting conditions. There are a lot of different kinds, but generally speaking, a limiting condition is anything that restricts how quickly we can proceed, and therefore something we want to achieve as soon as possible. A simple example would be waiting for a door to open. We can't possibly move past the door until it's finished moving, so it doesn't really matter what Madeline is doing in the time that we're waiting. What is important is how quickly we get it to start. In this example, Madeline throws herself at the doorbell coin and has to scramble back up, but it doesn't matter since we still need to wait for the gap to be wide enough to fit through. Here are a few other examples of limiting conditions. For this berry in Summit, we cannot possibly collect it until it reaches this point, and it begins its journey as soon as we dash. We therefore want to dash as soon as possible while still being able to meet the berry at the finish line. In Mirror Temple, we need to use the momentum from this block to reach the top exit of the screen. How quickly we can get the block to start moving upward is therefore the limiting factor. We need to dash at least once to get it to move down, but then every subsequent dash resets the timer. So we want to dash as soon as possible, and then not dash at all for the rest of the screen. Here's another example of a room in which, after we've collected all the coins, we can easily reach the door before it has started to open. The limiting factor is how quickly we can get it to start, or equivalently, how quickly we can touch the last coin. That's why you see Madeline apparently swing needlessly far out to the left to grab this coin, and also why she loses a bit of time not fast falling immediately. For this one, the limiting factor is pretty obvious. It's how quickly we can touch Madeline. That's why it may seem a bit odd that we take this indirect line when we can clearly jump higher and dash forward, or jump farther and dash later. It seems like the fastest path to Madeline would be as direct as we can get, so why don't we do one of those instead? Well, if I turn on hitboxes, all will become clear. For Madeline, bubbles, birds, and a few other things, the limiting factor is how quickly we can touch their circular hitbox. After that, Madeline gets automatically drawn into the center over the same number of frames. In this case, we can narrow it down even further. The limiting factor here is actually our horizontal movement. We can adjust the vertical all we want by manipulating our jump height and dash direction, but we can't possibly touch Madeline's hitbox until we are far enough to the right. That's why we take this sort of weird line to aim for the very left side of the circle. And because we're only concerned about horizontal movement and not the vertical, that's why we get this sort of bizarre sequence of inputs. We want a 14-frame dash because the sooner the dash, the faster we're going, and the dash sends us pretty high up, so we do a low jump right before it in order to compensate. This brings our discussion to a different sort of limiting factor, ones that are based on movement. Let's take a look at this room. Obviously here the goal is to lose height as quickly as possible. Our vertical movement is the limiting condition here, and horizontal doesn't matter. Most of the time we're going to be fast falling at terminal velocity, except for when we need to dash around obstacles. The time after a dash that we spend accelerating back up to terminal velocity is what we need to minimize. And that's why you see these two dashes strategically placed as close to each other as possible. By minimizing the time between dashes, we cut out as much of the slowness as possible. Compare that with this section of 7b. The first limiting factor to consider here is the horizontal, but because the distance to cover is so great, we're actually going to spend a lot of the time in the air at walking speed, meaning that as long as we reach that base speed after each dash, it doesn't matter where they are positioned, the distance covered will be the same. So the important limiting factor here is once again vertical, but this time we want to lose height slowly. Whereas before the frames right after a dash were slow, and so we wanted to eliminate as many as possible, this time we want to keep as many as possible, so we're going to be spacing our dashes out evenly. Let's take a look at the speeds involved here. Coming off of the spring, you can see the first thing that happens is we reach walking speed, and every frame thereafter is 90. We also reach 160 vertical speed before we begin the second dash. During the second dash, these are the important frames. We've got a lot of horizontal speeds higher than 90, and a lot of vertical speeds less than 160. So we're both going fast to the right, and staying high up. Once again, we hit 90-160 before the third dash, so we've milked all the possible distance we can get out of the second one. At the end of the third dash, we again hit 90-160, and so we even have a bit of wiggle room in the position of the dashes. Moving one of them a couple frames earlier or later wouldn't change the distance covered. It would basically be shuffling around the 90-160 frames between the dashes. If this wasn't the case, and we didn't reach 160 on all of them, then we would want the final velocity from each dash to be roughly equal, so that we avoid as many of the high velocity frames as possible. So the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to walk through the optimal movement for some general cases. And let's start with wall climbing. The first 12 frames of any wall climb are going to be the same speed, negative 105, and then we can input another climb jump, and it's perfectly fine for short walls. Because we're always traveling at negative 105 speed, this is completely optimal, and you're never losing any height. Once we run out of stamina though, we're going to have to jump to the other wall. You can see that the naive way to do this, I get 12 frames out, and I still haven't reached the wall, and on the 13th frame my speed goes down to negative 90, so I've lost a quarter of a pixel. Better way to do it is to do a single frame jump away from the wall, and now you can see I'm still within 2 pixels of the wall, so I can immediately perform another jump And that will get me to the other wall within 12 frames. And then I can simply jump back to the other wall and repeat this process indefinitely to climb optimally in gaps that are 4 tiles or less. For gaps that are 5 tiles, there is no way around it. Jumping between the walls, you are going to lose some height. So instead, what we're going to try and do is jump between the walls as little as possible, and that means conserving as much stamina as possible, which is where wall boosts come into play. And basically what a wall boost is, instead of doing a climb jump into this wall, I'm going to do a neutral climb jump. And what that lets me do is, as long as I turn away from the wall within 11 frames, you can see that 2 things are going to happen. Basically, there's a built-in leniency that lets you wall jump even after doing a neutral climb jump for 11 frames. And what it'll do is twofold. 1, it'll give me 130 speed to the left, but 2, it'll refill my stamina. You can see my stamina went from 55 back up to 83. So now when we jump to the opposite wall, I've got more stamina and I can do more climb jumps on this side, and in that way climb faster. Now let's have a look at climbing walls that aren't part of a tunnel. If you've got enough stamina, the typical 12 frame wall climbs will work just fine. And then when you reach the top, you can see that after 7 frames, that's when my speed hits 0, that's when I would be able to land on the ground. So you want to adjust your height so that you land perfectly after 7 frames. And in this case, it looks like 12 is a bit too high, so I'm going to try 8. That was a bit too low, we didn't land, so let's go 9. And this one you can see is a bit too high, I end up 1 pixel above the ground. So what I'm going to do in that case is just go to the climb jump prior to that, strike 2 frames off of that, and that should put us perfectly on the ground after 7 frames, and then I would get my dash back and be able to just keep plowing ahead. If you don't have enough stamina to be able to do that the entire way up, then what we can do is use wall boosts to get in some half stamina climbs. And the way that works is I'm still going to fit in 2 regular climb jumps because I want to use as many of these as I can because they're optimal. And then what I can do is I can stick in a wall boost here. So that's going to send me, on the next frame, I'm going to start jumping away from the wall and I'm going to get my stamina back. But I don't want to be wall jumping away from the wall because obviously that's going to send me far out to the right and I'd have to get all the way back, which is pretty slow. So instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to input a grab jump to the left, and that's going to allow me to negate some of the speed I get. You can see my 130 speed gets immediately cut down to 79. And I can jump up the wall essentially the distance of 2 climb jumps for the stamina of 1. You will notice at this point my speed is negative 75, so I do lose a little bit of height, but the stamina you save using the technique more than makes up for it. I can then put a second one of these, and at the end of this one, as before, I'm going to be carefully manipulating how much I hold jump for so that after 7 frames, we're going to land perfectly on the corner. Now let's say the wall is huge and you don't even have enough stamina to do half stamina climbs the whole way up. In this case, what we're going to be doing is a few half stamina climbs, so we can fit in 3 half stamina climbs. And now at this point I could fit in a 4th, but if I did that, I'd have to neutral up the entire rest of the wall, and neutrals are really slow. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to save that last half stamina climb for the top of the wall, and I'm going to do half stamina neutrals instead, which works pretty much exactly the same way. I'm going to do my climb jump, I'm going to do a wall boost, but this time instead of climb jumping back to the left, I'm going to input a neutral back to the left. And what that allows me to do is, instead of doing neutrals up the entire wall, I can do these sort of climb jump neutrals. And then when I hit the very top, I'll just do one more half stamina climb to land on the edge. And there is a slightly faster version that involves manipulating subpixels that's worth knowing about, but if you're new to TASing, you don't really have to use it. So that was upwards movement. Downwards movement is pretty straightforward. You just fast fall. The one thing that's worth mentioning is don't dash downwards, because if you dash down, then A, you lose a frame because the dash pauses for a frame, and B, after the dash ends, your speed will sink down to 180, after which you have to re-accelerate back to 240. So it's just not worth it. And that includes situations like this, where typically you would do a down left dash here. The TAS just lets go of fast fall for a bit, and that does mean that our speed slows down to 160 briefly. But because we avoid the dash, we avoid the long time it would take accelerating back up to terminal velocity, so it ends up being faster in the long run. For horizontal movement on flat ground, you're almost always going to be doing the same thing. 2-frame demo hyper to the right, and then a 7-frame bunny hop. And then you're going to use that speed into a grounded ultra. You can do a 6-frame bunny hop if you want. That would become a 3 if you're able to manipulate your position correctly, but it only saves 0.03 pixels, so generally speaking it's not going to be worth it. If you're canceling this first dash early, then instead of this, what you want to do is remove the demo hyper entirely, make that a 2, make that an 8, and what that'll do is it'll save you about a pixel. It only loses 1/4 of a pixel if you do it in the wrong spot, and it's slightly shorter than the other one. So if you want to memorize this one, I can't stop you, and you'll probably only lose a frame about 1 every 10 times. After the grounded ultra, we're gonna just jump out of that into a hyper and then turn that into another grounded ultra immediately, and you can chain these indefinitely along flat ground. If the ground is not perfectly flat, as is the case here, then we're going to want to be using delayed ultras, which is a fancy name for this tech where we do a downright dash, and now we cancel that downright dash before it lands on the ground. We essentially store the sliding state. By corner boosting out of this, we still get the speed that we had from the hyper, but now, next time we land on the ground here, you can see our speed goes from 285 to 334. We get the ultra on the ground, and because we canceled the dash, when we jump out of this, it does not become a hyper. So we get up to 368 speed. We can then downright dash into this corner, store that ultra for here. Now we're up to 468. We get another one here that brings us up to like 500 speed. And we go flying through that section. So if you have any sort of ragged ground like that, that is the perfect opportunity for delayed ultras. As a general rule, for horizontal movement along ragged ground, stay low to the ground as much as possible unless it kills an ultra chain. It'll give you earlier bunny hops, faster grounded ultras, sooner grounded ultras. It's just better. I'm going to quickly touch on some of the changes in elevation you can expect from flat ground movement. If you're stepping down 1 tile or 2 tiles, then it's not worth it to go for an ultra. You want to just continue your grounded ultras the whole way. If you're stepping down 3 tiles, it is worth it to go for an ultra. You want to do a bunny hop in this case to gain height faster so you can ultra sooner with more speed. If you're 4 tiles or higher going down, then no matter what you do, it'll be an ultra, so you can go ahead and hyper off. If you've got a step up in elevation, 1, 2, or 3 tiles, your first question should obviously be, can I use it to get a delayed ultra? If the answer is no, then you'll probably just want to bunny hop up to it, and then either turn that into a demo hyper, or a corner boost, or just land on the top and jump off it. If it's 4 tiles high, however, you won't be able to get enough height to bunny hop over it. So instead, what you're going to do in that case is probably dash up to it and then corner boost off of the edge to maintain that speed. And corner boosts in general are usually worth it if you only spend 1 frame against the wall. If you're spending 2 or 3 frames against the wall, then the speed needs to carry farther than the next grounded ultra. And the last thing we're going to talk about is rounding corners. So if you're heading down past a corner, the fastest way is to just dash down past it. If you need to save your dash, you can do a hyper and then graze the corner on the way down, but that will be 1 to 4 frames slower. Notice how the TAS swings out here before coming down to this corner. That's so that we get some momentum coming out of this corner. When you're fast falling past a corner, that's pretty much all you can do to speed up the process. When we're transitioning from a fast fall into horizontal movement, you ideally want to do a 14 frame down right dash, or as close as you can get to 14 frames, because that will be the most direct line. It does lose a bit of time getting to the ground, but it moves you farther over to the right. If horizontal movement is not a consideration, for instance because you're landing on a very small platform, or you have ample time to move left and right but you need to grab something in that spot, then in that case, ideally you want to fast fall all the way to the ground and then hyper, or if you need to save a dash, then fast fall and then do a 10 frame wave dash. Climbing up onto a ledge, we touched on this briefly, you want to spend 7 frames and then land. If you want to get a little bit further into the ledge, we can do that by turning around in midair and then heading back towards the corner. So we build up a little bit more speed and then we land deeper in after those 7 frames. What you don't want to do is you don't want to try and corner boost this, because in order for the corner boost to actually work, we need to spend less than 3 frames against the wall, which unfortunately means that we're going to be too high up in order to land after those 7 frames, so we lose time that we could be doing dash speeds, messing around with dashless movement, basically. If you want to now move forward, you basically just start horizontal movement again. However, if you want to go and head off to the right, the fastest way is obviously just to go ahead and do a hyper. If we're doing this, then we probably want to manipulate our position to be a little bit further to the right, for instance by doing something like 5 and then 2 to not be quite so deep into the corner. However, if we want to keep our dash out that direction, there's 2 things we can do. The simplest is just a reverse hyper, but slightly better than that. Well, I shouldn't say slightly better. They're both good in different circumstances, is jumping to the left and then doing an extended hyper off this way. So it's usually worth testing both of those, because they may be faster in different circumstances. And there is one last option for when we're trying to reach something that's very close and we really just need to jump back off the corner, is that we can do a delayed wall boost. So basically I do my neutral jump, I go up onto the corner, land, and then turn around. And now what's going to happen is that when I jump away from here, I'll get the 130 speed from the wall boost, plus 40 speed from the jump, so I'm already up to 163, and we're flying out here. So if you've got something really close by, like let's say right up here, this is probably going to be your best bet, because it doesn't waste 10 frames going for the extended hyper. And the last thing we're going to be talking about is moving around corners from beneath. The most direct way to do this is just with an up dash, and usually in this case you're going to want to make it a diagonal demo dash, because that will do 2 things. One, it'll make it so that you hit the ceiling later, and it'll also make it so that you, when Madeline gets around the ceiling, she's higher up because of the crouched hitbox. From here you can do a couple different things. You can do a reverse corner boost if you want to keep going in whatever direction you're traveling. If you want to immediately stop and lose all your speed, you can do a neutral jump and then climb into the wall like so. The other option we have would be doing a dash straight up, which would allow us to do a wall bounce, or simply climb up the wall faster, depending on the circumstance and the layout of the room and how much speed we're coming in with and how close we are to the ceiling. There's a number of factors, so it's worth covering both of these options. Worth noting in this case that a demo dash up will usually get you 1 pixel higher, and that's because of this right here, this corner correction that happens. By crouching, we make that happen at a different interval than if we had our full hitbox. And so we usually end up a pixel higher, but always test both options, because it is not always the case that the demo dash up will be faster. So that concludes the optimization section, and with that, the video. I hope you enjoyed, I hope you learned something. Good luck, and happy tassing.